Gamecock fans, I've got to come clean on something with all of you on today's show. I'm starting to get a little bit worried about South Carolina's recruiting on the interior defensive line.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, your show for the latest headlines and potential storylines on South Carolina Gamecock athletics. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch here today. We are free and available both wherever you get your audio podcasts daily and also on YouTube. And before we get into this Wednesday edition of Locked On Gamecocks, I want to let y'all know that today's episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege, and when you enter promo code LockedOnCollege, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order that you make. Shane Beamer and South Carolina's football program have missed out on yet another interior defensive line prospect in the 2024 recruiting cycle in Jordan Thomas, who committed to an SEC rival in the Georgia Bulldogs on Tuesday afternoon. And with what all happened with Jordan Thomas on Tuesday, South Carolina is now in a bit of trouble when it comes to their recruiting board for the interior defensive line position. Jordan Thomas, as I mentioned, committed to Georgia on Tuesday. He took an official visit to Athens just this past weekend, which clearly, based on some of the feelings he had about the Bulldogs going into the trip, put the Bulldogs over the top and led to the pledge that took place yesterday afternoon. Now, why is this a big blow for Shane Beamer and South Carolina? Well, here's the thing. They haven't just missed out on Jordan Thomas. They have now missed out on 3 different blue chip interior defensive linemen in this cycle that at one point were either heavy targets for the Gamecocks coaching staff or even at certain points may be leans to South Carolina. Those 3 prospects were Hevin Brown-Shuler, who took up to 8 visits to Columbia in his recruitment and wound up eventually committing to South Carolina's arch rivals in the Clemson Tigers. You've also got defensive lineman Justin Greene, who took 4 visits to South Carolina in his recruitment, and he had an official visit scheduled with the Gamecocks for the weekend of June the 9th through the 11th. He took an official visit to Georgia the weekend prior, and admittedly, he is from the state of Georgia, and with the seemingly increased sort of efforts that Georgia put towards Justin Greene in the past few months, all of that seemed to culminate into the Bulldogs winning over Justin Greene at the end of the day, and he committed to the Bulldogs, again, not long after his official visit to Athens. And then you got Jordan Thomas, who took 2 visits to South Carolina, so admittedly not as many as the other 2 aforementioned prospects, but Jordan Thomas also had an official visit scheduled for June the 23rd. He had a guy in South Carolina quarterback commit Dante Reno who was heavily pursuing him, it seemed like, behind the scenes based on some of the social media activity that we've seen from the QB commit in the past couple of months. And I'm not sure that that's going to happen at this point regarding Jordan Thomas's planned official visit because, again, he is now committed to Georgia. Now, how did all of this happen? How did Shane Beamer and South Carolina get to this point with all 3 of these prospects? Well, there's a couple different reasons why we are now where we are right now. Firstly, Clemson and Georgia, you gotta admit, both of them are currently top 10 programs when it comes to the sport of college football. Georgia right now is clearly above and beyond the number 1 program at this moment. And Clemson, they've been to the college football playoffs several times in the past several years, won a couple national titles, and both teams have developed reputations in terms of churning out NFL defensive linemen practically every single year now. So Admittedly, South Carolina was facing stiff competition when it came to what both of these programs can offer from a historical standpoint and also what both of these programs can offer in terms of development for the next level. That's not to say that South Carolina can't offer either of those things, but clearly this worked against South Carolina, I think, in each individual recruitment. Here's the other thing. This did not have as much of an impact on Hevin Brown-Shuler, but it clearly, in my opinion, impacted the recruitments of Justin Greene and Jordan Thomas. South Carolina has undergone a coaching change along the defensive line. Jimmy Lindsey took the defensive line coaching position at LSU back in late April. Travion Robertson then came in and is now the guy that is manning that interior defensive line position for South Carolina in regards to the coaching staff. And admittedly, I think that hurts South Carolina looking back because it doesn't ever do a program good when you've got a good relationship between one of your assistant coaches and a couple different prospects in a certain position group, and then said assistant coach winds up leaving and taking another job elsewhere. It restarts the entire relationship process in a certain way because as much as maybe Shane Beamer could have been involved or maybe some other assistants, the most important coach when it comes to these kind of recruitments is the position coach. And I don't think that Travion Robertson really could have done a whole lot more to try and help his case at the end of the day. I think that, honestly, he was simply a victim of the circumstances in both of those recruitments. Now, here's the other thing. I noted earlier that Justin Greene and Jordan Thomas committed to Georgia on the heels of official visits to Athens. So I know that some of y'all may be sitting there and wondering to yourselves, is there anything that Shane Beamer and company could have maybe done differently to give themselves more of a fighting chance in either one of these prospects' recruitments? And honestly, I think the answer to that would be no. I don't think there's anything Shane Beamer and the staff could have done differently regarding their official visit schedule. They've already made some changes as Shane Beamer and the staff, they're no longer hosting official visits throughout the middle of the week. They have 3 different official visit weekends throughout the month of June, one for the June 2nd through the 4th, the other one was for June 9th through the 11th, and the last one is for the weekend of June the 23rd through the 25th, because this upcoming weekend is Father's Day weekend, so they want to try to avoid any conflicts with, obviously, what is a widely recognized holiday in that sense. So when you combine all of this together, I think that for South Carolina, considering the programs they were facing in each of these recruitments and the timing of how all of this played out regarding a coaching change and also when each of these guys visited Georgia, in particular with Jordan Thomas and Justin Greene's case, there's not a whole lot maybe they could have done. But that does not mean that makes anything better regarding the recruiting situation currently on the interior defensive line. It does not alleviate the pain of missing on all 3 of these guys, whether they were taking their foot off the gas a little bit in any of these recruitments or not. And I'm not trying to say that that's why they missed out. But now, South Carolina finds themselves in a bit of a pickle when it comes to recruiting this position group. And with these recent developments, the 2025 defensive line recruiting board just became much more important for Shane Beamer and South Carolina. And we're going to dive into why that's the case in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. But before we touch on all of that, I do want to let y'all know that today's show is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Honest to goodness, we are all very, very simple when it comes to our clothes. There's not really a whole lot that we look for when it comes to clothes that we wear in our daily lives. We want clothes that are going to fit our bodies well. We want clothes that are going to feel comfortable. And when it comes to this day and age, we all want clothes that we can wear to multiple different functions or events. Clothes that we can wear casually or clothes that we can even wear to maybe going out to dinner, maybe going to a certain function at your local church or, any sort of kind of event that you're participating in. And Bird Dogs are the perfect shorts that fit all of that criteria. They are stretchy khaki shorts. They give you a sculpted look, and they have no strict or restricting fabric that you get in other shorts. And They are also perfect for you to wear all day long because of their anti-stink sweat wicking fabric, which helps to keep you cool and dry throughout the day. So go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege and enter promo code LockedOnCollege for your chance to get some Bird Dog shorts and also get a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler with every order that you make. I promise you, once you put Bird Dog shorts on for the first time, you'll never want to take them off. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. Thank you so much to all of you everydayers for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. You can find the Locked On Gamecocks podcast every day, both on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. All right, now let's talk about the 2025 recruiting board when it comes to the interior defensive line position for South Carolina's football team, because the Gamecocks have missed out on a lot of targets from the 2024 cycle, as we talked about earlier in the show. And because of that, now this 2025 group of targets is now much more important when it comes to this next cycle. The main reason being, Shane Beamer and South Carolina can ill afford to go 2 straight recruiting cycles having multiple swings and subsequent misses on their top targets at a certain position group. If the Gamecocks want to be able to compete with some of the heavyweights in this sport, teams like the Georgia Bulldogs, the Alabama Crimson Tides of the world, the LSU Tigers, and some other programs outside of the SEC, then they have got to try and make sure that they are not falling behind when it comes to recruiting certain position groups. We already were starting to see this happen at the beginning of the Shane Beamer era with position groups, say, like the wide receiver position, and in a way, the tight end position and the running back position. You cannot have that happen when you are an SEC program that is trying to climb your way up to the top of the ladder. And for South Carolina, when looking at this 2025 recruiting board on the interior defensive line, they've got 2 prospects in particular that are going to be really important targets for them in this next cycle. The most notable one by far is Elijah Griffin. And the irony here is that South Carolina is battling the Georgia Bulldogs for Elijah Griffin. Griffin is right now rated by On3's consensus player rankings as the number 1 prospect in the entire country for the 2025 class. And right now, he is either one of just a few or potentially even the only prospect that is currently rated as a 5-star by each of the major recruiting services: On3, Rivals, ESPN, and 24/7 Sports. Goes to show just how big of a prospect Elijah Griffin is for this next class. Now, here's the good news for South Carolina. They have received as many visits as the Georgia Bulldogs have to this point in Elijah Griffin's recruitment. And the other thing is, Elijah Griffin has already started to formulate a relationship with the Gamecocks' new interior defensive line coach in Travian Robertson, whom Elijah Griffin talked to late last month. And the other sort of big target for South Carolina at the interior defensive line position for the 2025 class is in-state prospect Amare Adams. Adams is rated by On3 as the 13th best defensive tackle prospect, or the 130th best prospect nationally in the 2025 class according to their consensus player rankings. Now, Amare Adams was a Lake City High School product, but he has now recently announced that he is transferring to South Florence High School, the old stomping grounds of current Gamecock quarterback Lenoris Sellers. And here's the thing. With Amare Adams, the Gamecocks have already probably built out a massive lead for the Palmetto State native, as Adams has already visited Columbia on 7 different occasions to this point in his recruitment. Now, when it comes to how South Carolina needs to perform with both of these prospects in terms of trying to land their pledges or commits, I think that South Carolina, there's no question, at the bare minimum, you've got to get Amare Adams in the 2025 class. Right now, it would be viewed as a massive upset in the recruiting world if Amare Adams ended up going anywhere else but South Carolina. The Gamecocks have been doing a much better job in the past couple of cycles of keeping the best prospects from the state of South Carolina within their state's borders. That includes interior defensive lineman Xavier McLeod, who was a big recruit in the 2023 recruiting cycle. South Carolina had to fend off a plethora of nationally recognizable programs, including the Georgia Bulldogs, to keep Xavier McLeod in state and eventually have him come to South Carolina. They now got to try to do the same thing with Amare Adams, who is undoubtedly going to be pursued by an abundance of prestigious programs all the way up until the time he signs the dotted line on his national letter of intent. In my opinion, if South Carolina continues to perform at the rate they have in the 2024 recruiting cycle when it comes to the interior defensive line position, then you could also make the argument that they need to land Elijah Griffin. Now, here's the thing. Elijah Griffin is from Savannah, Georgia, so technically he is a Georgia native. And I did mention earlier, the Gamecocks are currently battling head-to-head with the Georgia Bulldogs right now for the commitment of Elijah Griffin. But here's the thing. South Carolina, in my opinion, can make the case to Elijah Griffin for why he should come to Columbia instead of Athens, despite it being the home state program and a program that's won the last 2 national championships. How? Well, here's the thing. Elijah Griffin is 56 miles closer to Columbia than he is to Athens. So it's a little bit less distance for his family to have to travel if they want to be able to go and watch him play on Saturdays in a couple of years. Here's the other thing to think about here. Georgia, right now, clearly is just continuing to stack talent, basically reload when it comes to the trenches on the offensive and especially the defensive line. But this is the thing. When it comes to programs like Georgia, there is eventually a bit of a diminishing return when it comes to certain prospects and the aspect of playing time. Because when you continue to stack up so much talent, at some point, somebody's not going to be able to play. Now, is that to say that they maybe view Justin Greene and Jordan Thomas in a much higher light than they do Elijah Griffin? No, I'm not trying to say that at all. But what I will say is this. In the next 2 seasons, South Carolina is set to lose at the minimum Tonka Hemingway, Elijah Davis, and Nick Barrett. And in that same stretch, they could also lose Alex Boogie Huntley and TJ Sanders, depending on how their situations unfold. Right now, that is basically at least 4 of their top 5 defensive linemen, and definitely their 5 most experienced defensive linemen at the collegiate level. What does that mean? Well, what it means is this. If Elijah Griffin came to South Carolina with all that playing out the way I just laid it out to all of you, Elijah Griffin would literally be a lock to be a starter the moment his foot steps onto campus here at South Carolina. When it comes to Georgia, again, that's not to say that he wouldn't have a chance to play early there, but there will be a lot more competition in terms of getting snaps. South Carolina, of course, they like to pride themselves on competition, but there's just no question that if you want to be able to start immediately, South Carolina is the spot for you. Your family would be able to come and see you in Columbia much easier than they could when it comes to Athens. Again, it's maybe not the biggest difference in both of those aspects or those facets of his recruitment, but they are important, and South Carolina needs to take whatever they can get when it comes to a battle like Elijah Griffin when they are taking on the back-to-back reigning national champs in the Georgia Bulldogs. So, overall, because South Carolina is best on so many 2024 guys, 2025, in my opinion, now becomes the class where you have got to bounce back in that cycle. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You cannot go 2 straight cycles missing out on all of your top targets. And South Carolina, they're heavily in the game for 2 of the best in the entire country, and Elijah Griffin and Amare Adams. You certainly can't miss out on both. At the minimum, you need to land Adams. And when it comes to Elijah Griffin, listen, I know a lot of people are going to write them off just simply because they are fighting the Georgia Bulldogs for a Georgia native. I know that's going to happen. You all know that's going to happen. That does not mean that South Carolina should be counted out by any means, though. They're going to be fighting in that recruitment all the way to the very end. And at this current rate, South Carolina, they very well may need to win that recruiting battle with how things are currently going on the interior defensive line in 2024 recruiting. All right, now to cap off this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, I know that up to this point, I have seemingly sounded quite pessimistic regarding South Carolina's recruiting efforts when it comes to the interior defensive line. So I do want to end today's show on a bit of a brighter note when it comes to the recruiting at the running back position, because there was a running back target who just posted something very recently that if you're a Gamecock fan, you have got to love. And that running back target that I'm talking about is Arkansas native Braylen Russell. Now, Russell visited South Carolina officially back on the weekend of June the 2nd through the 4th. That visit apparently went pretty good based on his social media activity, and it may have gone even better than we all initially thought, because Braylen Russell was in a 7-on-7 tournament just earlier this week and had some photographs taken of him out there on the field. And there was one photograph that captured him trying to receive a pass. And with his hands being held up, you can clearly see that Braylen Russell is wearing South Carolina Gamecock gloves on his hands. Now, there's a couple of reasons why that is relevant. Firstly, for those of you that are going to sit there and say, once again, Andrew, just because he's wearing gloves that have the South Carolina logo on them does not mean he's going to end up in Columbia automatically at the end of the day. And you know what? I cannot dispute that point. But what I will tell you all is this. Again, you got to think about the way that today's recruits operate. These recruits, they understand how social media works. They understand how to get the attention of certain programs and schools. And in this case, I don't think you could view this as a bad thing by any means for South Carolina. The fact that this is an Arkansas kid who at one point was committed to Arkansas, the Razorbacks are still viewed as a heavy contender here in the recruitment of Braylen Russell. And a month away from his commitment date, exactly 1 month away, he is wearing Gamecock gloves in a 7-on-7 camp where he knows some people are going to probably be taking photos of him out there on the field. I think that's a pretty big deal if you're Shane Beamer, Monterio Hardesty, and the rest of the South Carolina offensive coaching staff. Here's the other thing. Right now, Braylen Russell currently isn't scheduled to take any more visits to any other schools. He took an official visit to the Baylor Bears back on the weekend of June 9th through the 11th. But since then, he hasn't visited anywhere else. Maybe he could take another visit to Arkansas or Tennessee. But it kind of seems like that things are starting to slow down in Braylen Russell's recruitment. South Carolina right now, they got a few targets that are standing out to them at the running back position. Daniel Hill from Mississippi has obviously been one for several months now. Georgia native Matthew Fuller has really climbed up the recruiting board in the past couple of weeks. And Braylen Russell has sort of been a guy that's been quietly in the background when it comes to the running back position. I admittedly probably have not talked about him enough on this show, but I can promise you after now seeing this photo get out there on social media in the past day or so, we're going to talk about him a good bit more as we get closer to his commitment. Again, Arkansas and Tennessee are still a couple of other teams to watch here in this recruitment, but for South Carolina, again, this is a good sign in my opinion. The fact that it has now been almost 2 whole weeks since he took his official visit to South Carolina, and the Gamecocks are still on his mind to that high of a degree, the Gamecocks might be more in the game here than some originally thought. Maybe South Carolina can beat out the Homestead Arkansas Razorbacks and can beat out the Tennessee Volunteers, who they've already been battling for several other running back prospects. They lost out on running back Peyton Lewis from the state of Virginia. They again seem to be the front runners to land running back Daniel Hill, whom Tennessee is also pursuing to a certain extent, and you've got Braylen Russell from the state of Arkansas. So a lot of sort of crossover here between Tennessee and South Carolina on a lot of these running back targets. Just another important reason why South Carolina wants to win this recruiting battle, because again, Tennessee, you got to give them some credit. At least to this point in the Josh Heupel era, the Volunteers have emerged as a bigger threat once again in the SEC. And if you're a Gamecock, you want to try and stay ahead of the Volunteers. You want to be able to at least match them on the recruiting trail, if not do better. Getting Braylen Russell over Tennessee and Arkansas, plus potentially landing a Daniel Hill and maybe even a Matthew Fuller, would go a long ways towards doing that, at least when it comes to your off-the-field recruiting efforts. But with that being said, y'all, that is going to do it for today's show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show, as always. What are y'all's thoughts on some of the misses the Gamecocks have had recently when it comes to the interior defensive line? Are you a little bit concerned about all these top-notch prospects going to annual opponents right now for South Carolina? How much more important do you think that these misses make the 2025 recruiting class with targets like Elijah Griffin and Amare on the board? And lastly, what is your opinion on Braylen Russell and this photo that has circulated of him wearing Gamecock gloves in a recent 7-on-7 tournament? Let me know your thoughts on all those topics down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @aline_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. Once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope that y'all have a great rest of your day, and I will catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.